Good evening and Happy New Year to you, wherever you are. Our first talk of 2021 is by Hugh Hoffman, who originally hails from London, but has lived in Ladybank for 25 years and is no stranger to us. Hugh and his wife Doris have been members of Markinch Heritage Group for a number of years. Hugh has also spoken to us twice on members' nights. Firstly, he spoke on Vincenzo Linardi and then on Ladybank and its railway. Living in Scotland since attending Edinburgh University in the 1960s, Hugh spent his whole career as a market research consultant, and during this time was also engaged as a part-time lecturer in marketing at Dundee University. Hugh has a long established interest in both local and family history and is a past chairman of Fife Family History Society. He is also a lover of traditional Scottish music and would often accompany his wife on guitar. We have in the past been fortunate enough to hear both perform at our real-life talks. Hugh composes and sings his own songs and has also been known to burst into a bit of rock and roll when the mood takes him. So we're going to hand you over to Hugh Hoffman, a man who enjoys the gruesome, with tonight's subject, of course, being there's been a murder. So over to you, Hugh, and I'll talk you through sharing your screen. Okay. So if you could click on the share screen.
Okay.
And then there'll be another thing coming up where you have to share the screen.
Oh, application window, is that the one?
Oh, the application window, yeah, if you're at that, good. Yep.
Yeah.
And you can see your PowerPoint there.
Yeah. So click on that.
So click on that.
Share.
Yeah. Can you maximize that PowerPoint though?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's, yeah. And I'll go from beginning. I'll get the first slide up, yeah?
I'll get the first slide up.
Here we are.
When I get over to you here. Okay. It's all yours, Hugh.
Okay.
If you run the slideshow, you'll be fine.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. I hope you can see and hear us. This is an interesting way to give a talk, but I hope it works. Neil seems in full command of all the technicalities, so I'm in his capable hands. So the talk is called "There's Been a Murder," and I'm sure you all come across that phrase before. Crime generally attracts a great deal of public interest. It's a major topic of entertainment. There's hundreds of books and films and TV series based on crime, about criminals and about the police services and the legal processes that deal with crime. And a lot of this interest focuses on the most serious crime of all, namely murder. And just a few examples. Oh yes, the title of today's talk, "There's Been a Murder." I'm sure you will know it's the catchphrase from the TV series Taggart, which became very popular 20 odd years ago. But apart from Taggart, there's lots of other programs about murder. This was the original cast of Taggart. They've been through various changes over the years, particularly after the Mark McManus, the original actor who played Taggart, passed away some years ago. But they managed to keep the same quality of drama going, even with a different chief inspector. But there's lots of other shows, films, etc., based on murder. There's a few pictures here I'm sure you'll recognise. Murder, She Wrote. Murder on the Orient Express. one from the 50s, I think, an Alfred Hitchcock film, Dial M for Murder. I remember seeing these posters around when I was a youngster. And I'm sure you can come up with hundreds and hundreds of other programs that have got murder in the title. So I'd like to talk about murder in the context of Scotland, of Fife, and of Mark Inch specifically. So I'll start off with a few statistics. Nicola Sturgeon's daily briefings, she always starts off with some key statistics. So here's a few facts and figures that you might be interested in. There are around 60 murders every year in Scotland. This is a figure that's been fairly stable over the years. There are some variations. For example, I'm not quite sure why, but in 2010, there were 90 murders in Scotland. But overall, on average, it's about 60 a year. You occasionally hear the press talking about an increase in the murder rate, not specifically in Scotland, but there are a lot of knife crimes, particularly in the Greater London area, in the last 2 or 3 years among sort of teenagers and that sort of age group. So this obviously raises interest and raises the numbers a bit. But on average, it's about 60 a year in Scotland. I've got some international comparisons. The number of murders per 100,000 population. Overall, it's about 6.7 murders per 100,000 population per year. But there's quite a wide range within this. For example, El Salvador, which seems to have the highest murder rate, 61 per 100,000. That's nearly 10 times the average. Jamaica just is 57. There's a few countries that over 40 murders per year, Venezuela, Honduras, Lesotho. When we get to lower numbers, Russia, which I've always thought of as a fairly lawless country, but there's only 8 murders per 100,000. It's only slightly above the world average. The USA, it's 6 per 100,000. And the UK, and Scotland is the same as the rest of the UK, there's about 1 murder per year per 100,000. So we're fairly low down the scale. There are, of course, a few countries with whose average is fewer than 1 murder per 100,000, which I've listed there. And there were two countries that had no murders at all in 2018: the Vatican City and Andorra. But they were the only 2 countries that were completely free of murders. So murder is fairly widespread, but it's on a fairly low level in relation to populations over most of the world. So the background is that Scotland's murder rate is fairly low, especially when compared with some other countries. And I was going to talk about some Fife murders, and I've tried to pick out some that have got some interesting features, either because of the local nature or something about the case or the way the crime was solved, etc. So I'll start off with a murder that took place in 1830. The victim was a gentleman called James Milley, and the murderer's name was John Henderson. Just as a bit of background, I came across this murder about 25 years ago when I was with Fife Family History Society. We were preparing what we called the Fife Deaths Index. It's been available as a CD. It's got a huge amount of data. It's a record of over 250,000 deaths in Fife before 1855. 1855 is a key date in family history because that's when statutory registration of deaths and births and marriages was introduced. But before that, deaths were recorded in parish records, obituaries, etc., etc. So the society gathered information about 250,000 deaths. This was the CD that came out. It's still available. I think that it was originally launched in 2000. That this is the second edition, 2004. It's still available if you want to get in touch with the Family History Society. You can either get the CD or you can get the information online. So one of the main sources of information on deaths were the parish registers, which recorded deaths, births and marriages prior to statutory registration. And I was one of the large team of volunteers that were indexing the deaths when we were compiling this CD. And one of the parishes which I helped to index was Cooper. Most of the parishes, for their death records, they give the name of the deceased, the age, the relationship, where the deceased person lived. Cooper was a bit different because it also included the cause of death for each death. And one entry which really intrigued me was 30th of September 1830, Henderson John, and the cause of death was executed for murder, age 24. Now, of course, this was intriguing, so I had to find out more about the story of John Henderson and why he was executed. So the story of the murder, we go back to the victim, James Milley. He lived at a place called Winnie Park near Monimail. It's on the road between Colessi and Monimail. I don't know if you know that area well, but the house is still there. It's a splendid house, and it's still standing as it was nearly 200 years ago. Remember, this murder took place in 1830. That was a contemporary drawing of Winnie Park. And just for comparison, that's the house as it is today. It hasn't changed very much. They've now got a tarmac driveway and they've got proper gates, but if you compare the two pictures, they're very, very similar. Now, the story was as follows. James Milley was a bachelor in his 40s. He was a talented violin player, but more relevant, he was a successful linen manufacturer. And he employed a number of weavers. And they worked at Winnie Park, which is James Milley's home. Most of them lived in as well. And one of these weavers was John Henderson. And there's a picture of John Henderson, a contemporary drawing. This murder created an awful lot of interest locally, and there were several pamphlets were published at the time of the trial and after the event, which have been the source of much of this information. But that was a contemporary drawing of John Henderson. He was a native of Dunfermline, born in 1806. So at the time of the crime, he was 24 years old, and he lived in at Winnie Park along with some of the other weavers. Now, what happened apparently was that one evening, James Milley, the employer, and Henderson, the employee, had a blazing argument because Milley was complaining about Henderson's regular bouts of heavy drinking. The argument became quite violent and physical, and it ended up with Henderson hitting Milley several times over the head with a heavy object and killing James Milley. Henderson dragged the body into the garden and buried it. It does get a bit gruesome, but it's just facts of life or facts of death. Over the next 2 or 3 weeks, Henderson tried to sell expensive ornaments from the house to local neighbours, and there were several people who reported that he'd come to their door with valuable knickknacks and jewellery and gold ornaments, etc., which he tried to sell. He also invited some of his friends to stay with him at Winnie Park, where apparently they had a fairly riotous time drinking the deceased man's wines and whiskers. He definitely wasn't trying to cover his tracks. They were drawing quite a lot of attention to themselves. When neighbours asked about Mr. Milley, Henderson told them that his master had to travel to Edinburgh to conduct some business and would be away for a few weeks. And apparently the neighbours knew that there was a dispute about an area of ground that Mr. Milley was trying to purchase, and it seemed quite feasible that he'd gone to Edinburgh to try to sort out the transaction. Henderson even went to Edinburgh one day and posted a letter to himself back at Winnie Park, purporting to be sent by James Milley, saying that he would be away for longer than anticipated. So Henderson would show this to people who were wondering why Mr. Milley was away for so long. So he was quite devious in trying to set up an alibi for himself. After a month or so, James Milley's sister, who lived in Strathmiglo, became concerned about her brother, and they, with some friends, they paid a visit to Winnie Park, and no sign of Mr. Milley, but in the grounds they found a freshly dug area, and they discovered James Milley was buried in the grounds. They called a doctor who confirmed that Milley had died from multiple blows to the head. They also called the constable, who made some inquiries about Henderson, and he was tracked down to a lodging house in Dunfermline. Henderson was charged with murder and with theft of valuable ornaments, and he was tried in Perth High Court on the 8th of September 1830. What the pamphlets about the trial say, that the evidence took most of a day to present, but the jury only took a few minutes to decide that the evidence was overwhelming, and they delivered a verdict of guilty. So Henderson was hanged at Cooper Jail on the 30th of September 1830. Now, those of you that know the history of Cooper know that the jail is in the building that was later Watt's Seed Merchants, and was later a restaurant and bar called Watt's. It's now closed, but the building is still there. But that's where the jail used to be. Now, the pamphlets about the event say that there was a crowd of over 10,000 in attendance to watch the hanging. And if you remember that the population of Cooper at that time was only about 1,500, they must have been coming in by, well, it would be cartloads and on foot and on bicycles. This is before the railway, so they couldn't have come in by train, but there was a huge crowd that come in. And I'm going to talk a little later about public executions, because this was obviously a major feature of life in those days. So that was the crime and the trial and the execution. James Milley was buried in the churchyard at Monymail. The gravestone, which I have seen, though I gather it's now fallen and it's just leaning against the wall at the side of the churchyard. It said 1831, so the gravestone was put up a year after he was buried. James Milley, killed by an ungrateful and dishonest servant, 26/6/1830, aged 46, was unoffensive, a fair-dealing and respectable man. So that was the story of James Milley and his murderer, John Henderson. Another famous Fife murderer the victim was Margaret Maxwell, who was murdered by the Scanlon brothers, Michael and Peter, and this happened in 1852. The location of this was in Hilton of Fortha, which is very close to, it's only a couple of miles out of Markinch. It's at the top of Cadger's Brae. If you go from the road, the Fruchy Crossroads up the hill, that's Cadger's Brae, and at the top, about half a mile off the road, is Kirkfortha Cottage, or Hilton of Fortha. And that's how it was. That's from a contemporary drawing at the time of the murder. As it happens, I used to live very close to there, and I passed this house every day. And it's still got its sign there. So it's looking over to the Lowman Hill. So even though you can't actually see the cottage clearly from the road, you can see the road end. Now, Margaret Maxwell, the victim, she ran a small shop from her home at Hilton of Fortha. The Scanlon brothers worked in a nearby lime quarry, and the Scanlons were Irish. They were from County Mayo in Ireland. They'd been working in Scotland for some time, and they lived very close to Margaret Maxwell, and obviously purchased goods from her shop. One day she refused to supply any further goods on credit because the brothers had run up her outstanding bills, which they were unable to settle. So that there was a bit of a row there, and then one night the Scanlon brothers broke into the house, attacked Mrs. Maxwell, and left her dead. They made off with cash and some goods from the shop. After their arrest, they were tried, found guilty of murder and robbery with violence, and sentenced to death. The death sentence was carried out on a temporary scaffold which had been erected on the Fluthers in Cooper, which is now, I'm sure you know, it's now a big public car park, close to Cooper Jail. And as I say, this was later. This building was later Watts Seed Merchants and Watts Restaurant. And once again, the area was filled with crowds who assembled on foot. By now, they could come by train because the railway had arrived in Cooper about 5 years previously. Now, this was interesting because the authorities were quite concerned that these two Irish brothers were about to be hanged, and there was an awful lot of Irish immigrants were living in Dundee, and the authorities were worried that they might try to come over and rescue their countrymen, save them from the gallows. So to protect the event, a large detachment of troops were on hand, and several hundred special constables were specially sworn in. So this was obviously considered a genuine risk that crowds of Irish immigrants would come over to try to save the Scandals from the gallows. In the event that the execution passed off without incident, the accounts say that just as it was finishing, there was a mighty thunderstorm, and the torrential rain quickly cleared the crowds from the streets. So that possibly helped to keep the troubles down as well. And this was the last public execution in Fife, the 5th of July, 1852, the Scanlon brothers. While we're on the subject of public executions, it's interesting that public executions were very common. It was one of the normal ways of executing those sentenced to death, and they continued in Scotland for another 16 years. The last one was in 1868 in Dumfries. Robert Smith, who was found guilty of murder, rape, and robbery. But between 1800 and 1868, there were 263 public executions in Scotland, mostly men, but also included 14 women, and also a further 200 people sentenced to death, but reprieved. The crimes committed by the 273 who were executed in public, murder was the most frequent, 125, but it also included housebreaking, robbery, highway robbery, and a few archaic legal terms: stealth thief, forgery, theft, horse theft, uttering, rape, treason, hamesucking, sheep stealing, and arson. So although public execution was normally in relation to a murder, it was by no means entirely for murder. And for those of you that were wondering, these three terms, uttering, tendering forged money or a document with an intent to defraud, I think that uttering still has that meaning in legal circles. But these other two terms I think have fallen away. Hamesucken is violent assault on a person in his own home, and stealth thief was violent housebreaking. So just in case you were wondering what these archaic terms were, that's your answer. As one special case of public execution, between 1801 and 1841, 37 offenders were executed at the scene of their crimes. It was believed that if the execution took place where the crime had taken place, that would bring home the message much more strongly to the population that they wouldn't get away with it. So there were 37 of these public executions took place at the scene of the crimes. After 1868, after public executions, there were still death sentences were still quite common, and for example, another 40 odd between 1869 and 1899. Though interestingly, of the death sentences that were passed, only about half actually were carried out. They tended to be commuted or converted to imprisonment, or people sent to the colonies. The death penalty didn't actually end in the UK until 1969. It had rarely been used for quite a while before that. It's difficult to see whether ending the death penalty actually encouraged the murder rate to rise, but apparently the way that data is recorded has altered so that multiple killings by one perpetrator used to count as one crime, whereas now each murder is counted separately. And Harold Shipman, the doctor, had 173 victims, so that would have been 173 crimes. Previously, it might have just been counted as one. Unsolved murders. This is an interesting avenue. There apparently, since records began the early 1800s, there have been 93 unsolved murders across Scotland. And interestingly, the Crown Office refuses to release details in case doing so would tip off the suspects and would disrupt ongoing police investigations. There's only been one unsolved murder in Fife, fairly recent, June 1991. 33-year-old Sandy Drummond was found strangled on a farm track near his home at Boar Hills, again fairly close to home. Apparently, over the 4 days prior to his death, he had withdrawn several sums of money from his bank accounts. He worked at Garbridge Paper Mill, and he contacted his employers to say he was resigning and he wouldn't work his week's notice. After his death, most of the money he had withdrawn was found in the house he shared with his brother. I'm not sure if the brother was ever suspected, but it was a strange case. It's believed that he was killed by a chokehold used in jiu-jitsu, because the post-mortem had found no ligature had been used. There was no sign of a rope or a cord to strangle him, and no external marks to suggest pressure from hands or fingers. So this is why they think it was maybe a chokehold used in jiu-jitsu. There was a main suspect identified by the police, but this suspect has subsequently passed away. And it's believed that the case is being kept open in case the police trace any accomplices. So this is the only unsolved murder in Fife. If anyone's got any information, then I'm sure the police would be delighted to hear from you. Some other interesting murder cases in Markinch itself. Going back a bit, 1771, there was a lady named Belinda, or Belle, and she was described as a black girl or woman from Bengal. Now, I think it was interesting that there were people from that part of the world and that skin colour were in Markinch as long ago as 1771. She was a slave or servant to John Johnson of Hangingshaw, which is in the Borders, but she had been residing in Balgony, and she was found guilty of child murder. She'd had a child, concealed the pregnancy, killed the child, and disposed of the body. And her punishment was life banishment to His Majesty's plantations, or His Majesty's plantations in America. So I thought that was interesting, because that's evidence that there were people from India or from Bengal in Fife at that period. Another murder locally was 1805. Elizabeth Peggy. She was a cook. She lived in New Inn in Markinch. She was found guilty of child murder, similarly to Belle, to the previous one. She killed her infant, and she was also punished by life banishment from Scotland. But the sentence said, previous to which she was to be whipped through the streets of Perth at the hands of the common executioner, receiving the ordinary number of stripes upon her naked back at the usual place. It doesn't actually say what the ordinary number of stripes was or the usual place, but it's interesting that this little addendum was added to her sentence. So those were two murders in Markinch. Slight diversion now. I mentioned the Fife Calendar of Convicts. This is a source of information that was published by Fife Family History Society 3 or 4 years ago. It was compiled by Andrew Campbell, who's a former editor, chairman of the society, and it's the result of several years' work. This was how the CD was produced. You can either have it in the form of a CD, or you can get it online from the Family History Society's website. And basically it's an index of court records over the period 1790 to 1880. It was sheriff courts, magistrates, police courts. It was mostly minor cases, theft, assault, poaching, fraud, etc. But there were also some high court cases included, which involved crimes committed in Fife or which involved Fife residents. I'm going to talk a bit about then and now. There's some interesting parallels and similarities between murders across the centuries. There was a case very recent, in 2014, Liam Fee, which you may remember. He was age 3. He was murdered by his mother and her partner, Rachel and Naomi Fee, in Glenrothes. Couldn't get much closer to home than that. This was Liam and Rachel and Naomi. Their pictures are in the papers fairly regularly at the time their trial was taking place. Over a 2-year period, the toddler and 2 other young boys were locked in a cage, forced to eat dog excrement, forced to sleep in a room which also contained a boa constrictor, which the ladies said would eat him if he was naughty. So it's a fairly scary sort of situation. The pair were found guilty of murder. They received life sentences, one 24 years, one 23.5 years. But this example of child murder, although this was only 6 years ago, it's not a new phenomenon. And looking back through court records, we find many similar cases. For example, this is where the child was killed or abandoned and left to perish by the mother. Often it was a young unmarried girl, either because it was socially unacceptable to have a child out of wedlock, or they simply couldn't afford to keep the child, so they would kill it or just leave it to die. And this was fairly common. And looking through the records in the calendar of convicts, there are dozens of cases which you might call infanticide, where it was the young infant was left to die. Just to show that the case of Liam Fee wasn't novel. In 1839, there was a case where the murderer was, her surname was Shedden, described as a widow. She was jailed in Dunfermline on suspicion of child murder. The child was found in the horse pond of a farm at Camps with its tongue cut out. So that's a fairly sickening sort of situation. 1851, Mary Trail in Balcurvey, aged 29. The body of her newborn daughter was found buried in a garden between the rows of cabbages. This is very similar to what was found with James Miller's murder when he was buried in a garden. She received 12 months in prison. So sadly, these examples show that things haven't changed very much over the centuries. The type of murder, particularly child murders, and the way that they're carried out and the cruelty involved, although it seems pretty awful in the 21st century, it's got parallels with what's happened in the past. One other aspect of murder which you might be interested in, serial killers. There have been quite a few famous Scottish serial killers. Peter Manuel, Peter Tobin, Archibald Hall, Angus Sinclair. These are people that commit several murders. It's not just one victim. They continue killing over a period. Peter Manuel, he was around in the 40s and 50s. He was actually born in New York of Scottish parents, but he came back to Scotland, lived in Lanarkshire. He was convicted of a series of petty crimes in his youth, including a series of sex attacks. In 1858, he was convicted of 7 murders, 6 in Lanarkshire, 1 in Newcastle. And I remember at the time, the people in Lanarkshire and Ayrshire were really quite terrified of strangers knocking on their door at night in case it was Peter Manuel. He did actually create quite a climate of fear. He was hanged in 1958 in Barlinnie prison. Peter Tobin, not a very nice looking face. He was born in 1946 in Johnston, and he committed 3 murders between 1991 and 2006. One of his victims was 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton. This was another case that was in the papers quite a lot in the 90s and 2000s. She disappeared. She was last seen in 1991 waiting for a bus in Bathgate. After that, there was no sign of her for a number of years, all sorts of theories about what had happened to her. Go forward 16 years, and in 2007, human remains were found at a house in Margate in Kent, a long way away from Bathgate. This was a house that had once been occupied by Peter Tobin, and the remains were identified as being those of Vicky Hamilton. So Tobin was sentenced to life imprisonment. Archibald Hall, a smooth-looking face there. He was born in 1924. He worked as a butler for several upper-class families in Scotland and England. He was convicted of 4 murders, with one outstanding that the police were not able to prove. They didn't have enough evidence. His victims included Walter Scott Elliott, who was a former MP, and Dorothy Scott Elliott. He worked for them as their butler, but he ended up killing them both. His last victim was his own half-brother, Donald. Now, this was interesting because Hall was staying at a guest house in North Berwick. Police became suspicious because his car's number plate didn't match the number on the tax disc. I think that they were at a guest house, and the guest house owner was a bit suspicious about the car and about Hall, so the police came to investigate. So they searched the car, and in the boot they found the body of Donald. This was Archibald Hall's half-brother. So it seems a bit careless leaving your victim's body in your car boot where it could be found. But anyway, that was an interesting end of that case. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1978. While he was in prison, he actually wrote his autobiography entitled A Perfect Gentleman. And he died of a stroke in prison in 2002, aged 78. I don't think there's many murderers who've written their autobiographies, but I've not seen it, but it'd be interesting to see what he was saying about his life. And the final serial killer I'll mention is Angus Sinclair. That was how he looked when he was arrested. I think some years later he'd grown a beard. He was convicted of 4 murders with 4 further suspected murders. He was first convicted in 1961 when he was just a teenager. And he was involved with the World's End murders, which took place in 1977. This was a famous case that was in the papers on and off for a number of years. 2 teenage girls were last seen in the World's End pub in Edinburgh's High Street in 1977. A few days later, their bodies were discovered in 2 different locations in East Lothian. They'd both been raped and strangled. And this remained a mystery. This was the 2 girls, Christine Eady and Helen Scott. There were all sorts of theories about what had happened to them, who might have committed the crime. And in 2007, eventually the police brought him to trial. The murders had taken place in 1977, so it was 2007 before the trial, so it had taken 30 years to come to trial. But he was acquitted. And what really made this case interesting, that he was tried again in 2014, and this time he was found guilty. And this was based on new DNA evidence that hadn't previously been available. And in the meantime, the law had been changed, because there used to be a law called double jeopardy, which meant a suspect who had been found not guilty could not be retried for the same crime. But I think because the evidence that had come to light about Angus Sinclair was so convincing, the law was changed so that he could be retried on the basis that evidence that was now available hadn't been available previously. And if it had been available, it would have resulted in a different outcome. I think it was as DNA techniques improved and DNA samples could be analysed not much more accurately. Anyway, so Sinclair was the first person in Scotland, I think, to have been acquitted of a murder and subsequently found guilty. And he died in prison in 2019. Just to finish off, I'll go back to how we started. Remember, I said at the start of this talk that murder as entertainment has been the subject of many films, etc., TV programmes. In 1947, the Scottish playwright James Bridie wrote a play Dr. Angelus, and this was based on the case of Edward Pritchard. There's Edward Pritchard. He was executed in 1865 in Glasgow. He was an English doctor. He was living and working in Glasgow, and he was convicted of murdering his wife and his mother-in-law by poisoning them. It's thought that he was having an affair with the housemaid, and the wife had found out, and in order to keep her quiet, he murdered her and her mother. He was the last person to be publicly executed in Glasgow. Thousands of spectators watched the event on Glasgow Green. This was in July 1865. And this was an interesting case because one aftermath of the Pritchard trial, he was represented by the Scottish law firm Macleay, Murray and Spence, who I believe is still in existence. After his execution, the law firm pursued his estate for their outstanding fees, but as there was no money in his estate to settle their bill, they arrested his wooden consulting chair along with some other property, and apparently the chair remained on display in the solicitor's boardroom until as late as 2016. That's the only case I've come across where a murderer's furniture was put on display by the lawyers who tried to defend him. So that was the interesting aftermath of that case. I tried to check on the Macleay, Murray and Spence website whether this had actually happened about arresting his chair. I'm not sure because according to their website, the company was only founded in 1871, and the execution took place in 1865. So that was 6 years. There's a 6-year time difference. It could be that it had taken them 6 years to try to get their fees paid, and at that point they arrested the chair. But anyway, it's an interesting story. So that's about all I was going to say. Thank you very much for listening. And I think your attendance at this talk is clear evidence that the subject of murder can still grab people's attention. So that I shall cease. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. We'll see if there's any questions arise. Certainly from my perspective, it's in some ways it does show kind of as you mentioned once or twice that nothing has changed substantially. People are still doing horrible things and doing things that they did all these years ago. Yeah. So okay, they're not banished to foreign lands, but yeah, the essence of it is all pretty much the same. But the one where they were using the house for parties and so on is yeah, that's incredible to in such big. Yeah, but maybe that was a kind of bluff thing. Who knows?
Well, it certainly attracted a lot of attention at the time, and as I say, there were several pamphlets were published after the trial had taken place, where they described in great detail the people who'd been at these events, at these social gatherings, and where they'd come from. Apparently, John Henderson, when he was on the gallows, he made some comment about having been influenced by the wrong sort of people.
Well, I suppose that's one way of putting it.
Yeah. Yes, if anyone's got any questions or comments, please let us know. We'll do our best to answer them.
Yeah, if you're.
When publication stopped and why?
In Scotland? Mm-hmm. Okay, I've got a question here, Hugh.
Mhm.
When were public hangings stopped in Scotland?
And why?
Well, and why? I suppose it was. Well, I'll let you answer that side.
I think what did I say? It was 1860. Hang on, I need to go back over the.
It seemed to be a lot of interest in them, so why did they stop?
Yeah, I think. Did you say that the Glasgow Green one was the last one? Was it?
1868 was the last one. No, oh yeah, Edward Pritchard. That was 1865. So the last one was Robert Smith in Dumfries, 1868.
And was this just through? Did it stop just through a shift in public opinion, or did it come the other way? Did it come sort of top down? Do you know?
I'm not quite sure, but possibly it was felt to be a bit bloodthirsty to be carrying on with this sort of event. It was certainly noticeable that it attracted huge crowds. The two examples that I gave. I mean, you hear stories of like the guillotine in Paris during the French Revolution, where people would sit around and the women would do their knitting and treat it all fairly calmly. But it looks like it was still a major source of entertainment in Scotland when it was taking place here.
And do you know when these public executions stopped in England, just as a comparison?
I'm not sure actually. No, I could look that up, but I don't know. I'll admit it. I don't.
It's interesting if there's any kind of it may have occurred round about the same kind of time, but so yes, if anybody has any questions but they're not logged in and unable to ask, then you could always email us or drop us a message on Facebook, and I could pass it on to Hugh, and you'll be okay to field those questions, Hugh, if any come through.
I could do some more digging around. I mean, I'll have a look and see about public executions in England. That's an interesting question.
Yeah. But for now, I think there's no other questions that I can see. So I think we'll just leave it there. And once again, thank you very much, Hugh, for that entertaining talk on our first outing 2021. And hopefully we'll be back in real life probably later on in the year. But we'll see. But thank you once again, and just wish everyone a good night. Thank you, Hugh. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening.